The desert was still that morning. A pale gold light spilled slowly over the ridges of distant hills, turning the horizon into a slow-burning flame. The wind was gentle, brushing against the tents like a whispered memory, carrying the scent of dust and the faint trace of wood smoke from last night's dying fire. Inside one of those tents, Abraham stirred. He had risen before the sun many times in his long life, but today felt different. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as though even the silence of creation was waiting for something to happen. He stepped outside, leaning slightly on his staff. His beard, streaked white from years of wandering and waiting on promises, caught the early light. The camp was quiet, servants still asleep, animals grazing lazily at the edges. Only the soft crunch of his sandals in the sand broke the stillness. Abraham's gaze drifted toward the horizon, the same horizon he had followed decades earlier when God called him away from his father's land, away from comfort and certainty, to a place he had never seen. That first call had changed everything. It began a journey filled with covenant and miracle, famine and war, joy and heartbreak. But nothing could have prepared him for the call he heard just yesterday. Abraham, God's voice had said, clear as the morning sky. Here I am, Abraham answered as he always did. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. The words still echoed in his mind like thunder, long after the storm had passed. His only son, the boy of promise, the laughter of Sarah's old age, the miracle born when hope should have been impossible. And now, this. Abraham had searched the sky that day hoping for some change, some softening of God's command, but there was none. Only the quiet certainty of the one who had spoken the stars into existence. And so, as he had always done, Abraham obeyed. Now as he readied for the journey, the camp began to stir. 2 young servants approached, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Isaac emerged from his own tent, fresh-faced with the innocence of youth. He was taller now, strong from helping his father with the flocks. There was curiosity in his eyes, the kind that looked for adventure, not danger. Father? Isaac asked, where are we going? Abraham managed a small smile. We're going to worship, he said simply. It was true, though the meaning of that word on this journey would run far deeper than Isaac yet understood. The preparations were simple, deliberate. Wood for the offering was cut and tied, a pouch of flint and knife was secured, bread and water packed. The donkeys shifted under their loads as Abraham tightened the straps. The journey began in silence. Sand crunched underfoot as the sun climbed, casting long shadows that stretched ahead like unspoken questions. Abraham kept his eyes on the path, but inside, his thoughts were a storm. Each step was a choice to trust the God who had never failed him, even when his ways seemed beyond reason. They passed rolling hills and barren valleys, the land changing in color and texture as the hours slipped by. Occasionally Isaac spoke, pointing at a bird in flight or a distant ridge. Abraham answered calmly, though his heart was anything but calm. On the second day they camped beneath a lone acacia tree. Night spread above them like a dark ocean scattered with stars. The same stars God once told Abraham to count, promising his descendants would outnumber them. Isaac slept beside the fire, breathing steady. Abraham sat awake, staring at the heavens. The constellations shimmered like eternal witnesses. Was this how the promise would be fulfilled? Through loss? Through surrender? By the third morning, the mountain was visible, rising like a sentinel in the distance. Abraham's heart quickened. Every step toward it grew heavier. At the base, he stopped and turned to the servants. "Stay here with the donkey," he said, voice steady but gentle. "The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and we will come back to you. We will come back." The words carried both faith and mystery. Abraham didn't know how God would do it, but he knew God would keep his word. Isaac took the wood on his back. Abraham carried the fire and the knife. Together they began the climb. The path wound upward, each step a fight against gravity and against the weight of what was to come. At last, Isaac spoke. "Father?" "Yes, my son. I see the fire and the wood, "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" The question pierced Abraham's heart, but he did not let it show. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." His words were steady, yet they were as much a prayer as an answer. When they reached the place God had shown him, Abraham built an altar from stones, his hands slow and deliberate. He laid the wood in place with care. Then, with a heaviness beyond words, he turned to Isaac. There is a moment in every life when obedience to God requires everything. For Abraham, this was that moment. Abraham's eyes met Isaac's, and in that instant, the world seemed to fall silent. The breeze that had brushed through the mountain grass stilled. The distant rustle of birds faded into nothing. It was as if all creation was holding its breath. Isaac did not resist. Perhaps he understood more than his father realized. Perhaps he trusted the God his father had followed all these years. Abraham's hands, calloused from decades of labor, trembled slightly as he bound Isaac with the rope they had so often used to secure bundles of wood or guide sheep to pasture. But this time the purpose was unthinkable. Every knot was an act of surrender. He laid his son gently on the wood. Isaac's eyes never left his father's face, searching for something. Maybe assurance, maybe a glimpse of the plan God had not yet revealed. Abraham drew a deep breath, the mountain air cold in his lungs, and reached for the knife. Time slowed. He felt his heartbeat pounding in his ears, a steady drumbeat of faith and anguish. His hand lifted the blade, every muscle taut, his soul torn between the fierce love of a father and the unshakable obedience of a servant of God. Then, "Abraham, Abraham," the voice thundered from heaven, not in anger but in urgent command. "Here I am," Abraham replied, his voice breaking. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the voice said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham froze. Relief surged through him like a flood, and the knife slipped slightly in his grip. He lifted his eyes, and there, caught by its horns in a thicket, was a ram. The animal struggled lightly against the branches, a living answer to the question Isaac had asked on the way up the mountain. God himself had provided the lamb. Abraham untied Isaac and pulled him into a fierce embrace, one that spoke all the words he could not say. Isaac clung to his father, his own breath shaking. Together they took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of Isaac. The smoke curled upward into the bright morning sky, a fragrant testimony of both obedience and mercy. Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day, people still say, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Then the voice of the Lord came again, this time carrying the weight of a covenant renewed. "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will possess the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." The words wrapped around Abraham like the warmth of the sun breaking over the mountain. This was more than the preservation of Isaac. It was the reaffirmation of a great promise, a golden thread that would weave through centuries, leading to another mountain, another father, and another only son who would carry wood on his back. As Abraham and Isaac descended the mountain, there was a lightness in their steps. The servants waiting below were astonished to see them both return. The journey home was quieter than the journey there, not from sorrow but from awe. God had tested, and God had provided. Yet deep in Abraham's heart, he knew this story was not complete. What happened on Mount Moriah was only a shadow of something greater yet to come. One day, God himself would climb his own hill, carrying his own burden. And this time, there would be no ram in the thicket. The road from Moriah stretched long and winding, but Abraham's thoughts were far from the dust beneath his feet. Each step still carried the echo of God's voice, fresh, trembling, unforgettable. The words were more than a reprieve for Isaac. They were a seal, a declaration that the God who called him from Ur to Canaan was not one deity among many, but the Lord who governs all history. Isaac walked beside him, occasionally glancing up at his father as if seeing him for the first time. He had been spared, yet something within him had shifted. He had felt the cords binding his hands, the wood beneath his back, the shadow of the blade above him. He had seen the ram caught in the thicket, a life given in his place. On the journey home, Isaac said little, but his silence was not born of fear. It was the quiet weight of reverence. As the sun dipped low, their camp came into view. Sarah, who had been watching the horizon, ran to meet them. Relief flooded her face, so strong it nearly broke Abraham. He held her longer than usual, his heart swelling with gratitude that the laughter Isaac's name promised would not be silenced. That night, after the camp had settled and the stars began to scatter across the velvet sky, Abraham lay awake. Above him stretched a sea of glittering lights, just as God had promised. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. He thought of that promise, of the generations yet unborn, and wondered how far the ripples of this day would travel. He remembered the words spoken on the mountain. Through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed. This was no small covenant. It spoke of something universal, beyond Canaan, beyond his lifetime. Abraham couldn't yet see the full picture, but he sensed the ram in place of Isaac was a signpost pointing forward. Someday, God himself would provide again, but that time, the sacrifice would not be spared. Years passed. Isaac grew into manhood, and the memory of Moriah became a sacred thread in their family's story. Around campfires, when tales of ancestors were told, Abraham would sometimes recount the journey up the mountain, the command, the 3-day walk, the voice from heaven, the ram in the thicket. He never told it for drama's sake, only with the awe of one who had looked deep into God's will and come away with greater trust. For Abraham, the mountain was more than a test. It was a revelation. God had not desired the death of his son. He had desired the surrender of Abraham's heart. And in surrender, Abraham had found not loss, but life. Centuries later, Moriah would be remembered as more than a place. It would become a symbol. Jewish tradition holds that Mount Moriah was the very site where the temple in Jerusalem would one day stand. Where Abraham built an altar of stone, Solomon would raise an altar of gold. Where a ram once took the place of a son, countless lambs would be offered daily. Yet all of it, the temple, the lambs, the blood, was still only a shadow of the greater provision to come. Prophets would catch glimpses of it. Isaiah would speak of a servant led like a lamb to the slaughter, who would remain silent. Zechariah would foresee a day when God would remove the sin of this land in a single day. Moriah was not just a memory, it was a prophecy etched into history. And in the fullness of time, another father would send his only son up a hill. This son, too, would carry the wood of his own sacrifice. But this time, no voice from heaven would stop it. No ram would appear in the thicket. On that hill, outside Jerusalem, God would do what he had spared Abraham from doing. But let's not rush there yet. To feel the weight of Calvary, we must linger with Abraham a little longer. Picture him in his final years, his beard white, his hands weathered like the stones of Canaan. He has seen God's promise unfold. Isaac alive, married, blessed. The land that once felt foreign now feels like home. Yet Abraham knows he is still a pilgrim, awaiting a city whose builder is God. He passed the story of Moriah to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, and Jacob to his 12 sons. It became a legacy of trust, not terror. A reminder that obedience to God is not the road to loss, but the path to life. Because in the end, Moriah was never about God taking something from Abraham. It was about God revealing himself to Abraham, that he is faithful, that he is provider, that he will never ask for a sacrifice without first giving the ultimate provision. From here, the story stretches wide, linking Abraham's altar to Bethlehem's manger, Solomon's temple to Golgotha's cross, one unbroken thread from the ram in the thicket to the Lamb of God. The wind swept across the ancient hills of Canaan, carrying the scent of dust, dry grass, and the faint smoke of distant campfires. Abraham stood alone, far from the tents, staring into the endless horizon. Days had passed since that moment on Mount Moriah, Days since the angel's voice stopped the knife in midair, since the ram appeared in the thicket, caught by its horns, offered in the place of his son. Yet the weight of that moment had not left him. It clung to his soul like the desert night clings to the earth, silent but unyielding. He remembered every detail. The way Isaac's voice trembled as he asked, "Father, where is the lamb?" The pounding of his own heartbeat as he tied the ropes, the smell of dry wood stacked on the altar. And above all, the voice that called his name twice, firm and urgent, pulling him back from the brink. The same voice that once told him to leave Ur, to trust, to go where he did not know. The voice of the one who promised. Abraham had followed that voice for decades, through famine, through exile, through battles, and now through the most impossible test of all. But what stayed with him most was not the fear of losing his son, but the realization of what God was revealing. The promise would never rest solely on human strength or human sacrifice. God himself would provide. Still, as he returned with Isaac down the mountain, the world around them seemed unchanged. Wars between kings continued. Idols still stood in high places. Sin and death still loomed over humanity like a shadow across every generation. The ram had died in Isaac's place, but deep within, Abraham knew it was not the final answer. It was a signpost pointing to something greater. In the seasons that followed, Abraham's life moved forward. He buried Sarah in the cave of Machpelah. He found a wife for Isaac, sending his servant to bring back Rebekah, ensuring the covenant promise would endure. He taught his son about the God who calls, who speaks, who sees. By evening fires, he retold the story of Moriah, not as a tale of human courage, but as a testimony of divine provision. Years passed, and Abraham watched the covenant grow in small, almost hidden ways. Isaac had sons. Those sons had sons. A family became a people. Yet even in the twilight of his years, Abraham knew the fulfillment was still distant. The blessing of all nations awaited its appointed time. Generations came and went, but the memory of Moriah endured. Fathers told their sons, rabbis taught their students. Around festival tables and in the solemn quiet of the synagogue, the story was retold. The father who was willing, the son who trusted, and the God who provided a substitute. It became more than history, it became hope. And hope has a way of surviving even in the harshest deserts. Centuries later, in villages across Judea, children still asked, "Why did Abraham almost sacrifice Isaac?" The answer was always the same, because God was showing us something. One day, he will provide the lamb. Those words, repeated for centuries, became the heartbeat of Israel's faith. Even when kingdoms fell, when they were carried into exile, when the temple was destroyed and rebuilt, the story remained, a lamp that would not go out. The shadow of Moriah stretched across history, touching prophets and poets. Isaiah spoke of a servant pierced for our transgressions. Jeremiah promised a new covenant. The psalmist sang of a king whose reign would never end. The people could not yet see the full picture, but the echo was there, always pointing forward. By the time Rome ruled the land, Abraham's descendants had heard the story for over 1,000 years. Roads now cut across the hills, foreign coins clinked in the marketplace, and soldiers in iron helmets patrolled the streets. But the promise endured. In a humble home in Nazareth, a carpenter named Joseph had grown up hearing it. His betrothed Mary knew it too, sung in lullabies, whispered in Sabbath prayers. And when their son was born in Bethlehem, the angels announced what the story had been hinting at all along. The Lamb had come. But this time, it would not be a ram caught in a thicket. It would not be an animal for a man. It would be the Son of God himself, willingly laid upon the altar of the cross. Abraham could not have known the details that day on Moriah. He could not have pictured Roman nails or a crown of thorns, nor imagined the empty tomb 3 days later. But he had seen enough to trust. He had seen the heart of God. The story of Abraham and Isaac was never just about one father and one son. It was the opening movement of a symphony that would build for millennia until the perfect note rang out on Calvary. And as the dust settled on the ancient hills, one truth remained. unchanged, unshaken, and eternal. The Lord will provide. Not just then, not just for Isaac, but for every soul in every generation who places their trust in the Lamb. Then, one night, beneath the endless canopy of desert sky, Abraham's life reached its quiet twilight. The tents were still, the flocks rested, the campfires faded to embers. Isaac sat beside him, listening as his father's voice, soft now, almost like the wind in the olive trees, spoke of the God who had called him from the city of Ur so many years before. Abraham's eyes, though dimmed by age, still held that faraway light, the gaze of a man who had seen beyond the veil of this life. "My son," he said, his voice steady despite the years, "I have walked with God through valleys and over mountains. He asked of me what no man could bear, and yet he bore it with me. Remember this, the Lord does not forget his promises. When he says he will provide, he will." Isaac nodded, his heart both heavy and comforted. He now understood that the story of Moriah was not merely his father's, it was his own. It was the story of their people. Generations turned like the passing of seasons. Jacob was born, wrestled with God, and limped into his calling. The 12 tribes took root in Egypt, flourished, and then groaned under the weight of slavery. Their cry rose to heaven, and God answered with a deliverer named Moses. Even in Egypt, the shadow of Moriah stretched across the centuries. On the night of the first Passover, a lamb's blood marked the doorposts. A substitute standing in place of the firstborn. God's provision, again. The children of Israel passed through the parted sea into freedom, carrying with them the covenant promise, unaware that the God who spared Isaac was still telling the same story. In the wilderness, they built the tabernacle, a movable dwelling for God's presence. At its heart stood the altar, where sacrifices were offered daily. Lamb after lamb, year after year, generation after generation. Each one a reminder. Each one a whisper of the day when the final lamb would come. Centuries passed. Kings rose and fell. The temple was built on Mount Moriah itself, where Solomon's gold gleamed in the sun, and the songs of the Levites filled the air. Pilgrims from across Israel climbed its steps, bringing offerings, lambs, and prayers. Yet even in the temple's splendor, the blood of animals could only cover sin, it could never remove it. The prophets began to speak with startling clarity. Isaiah described one who would bear the sin of many, crushed though innocent. Micah foretold his birth in Bethlehem. Daniel counted the days until the Anointed One would be cut off. These prophecies wove together like threads in a tapestry, each one leading back, always back, to Moriah. And then, one quiet night in a small town, the thread pulled tight. A young woman named Mary laid her newborn son in a manger. Shepherds came from the fields, wide-eyed with wonder. Angels had told them of this child, a Savior, the Messiah, the Lord. Somewhere in the unseen realm, the same voice that had stayed Abraham's hand whispered again, "Here is my son." This boy would grow, not in royal courts, but in a carpenter's shop. His hands, roughened by wood and nails, would one day stretch wide to embrace the world. He would walk dusty roads, heal the sick, touch lepers, and call fishermen to follow him. He would speak of God's kingdom, not as a far-off dream, but as something breaking into the present. And all the while, the shadow of Moriah lengthened. On another hill, not far from where Abraham once built his altar, Jesus carried his cross. The wood pressed into his torn shoulders. The crowds jeered, the soldiers mocked, the sky began to darken. Yet, he kept walking. This time, there was no ram caught in a thicket. The Lamb himself had come. At Golgotha they nailed him to the beams. The earth quaked, and the curtain in the temple tore from top to bottom. The way into God's presence, once barred, was now open. Abraham had once told Isaac, God himself will provide the lamb. Now, centuries later, those words had come to pass in full. 3 days later, the grave was empty. The stone rolled away, not to let him out, but to let the world see death had been defeated. The blessing promised to Abraham had reached its fulfillment. Through his seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. Not just Israel, but every tribe, tongue, and people. And this is where the story meets us. stepping out of the pages of history and into our own lives. The God who called Abraham still calls today. The same voice that provided on Moriah still provides. Faith is not easy, obedience is not painless. But the story of Abraham and Isaac shows us this. God's plan is never to take life from us, but to give us life in abundance. He calls us to trust, even when the road is steep and the destination unseen. If you've ever wondered whether God sees you, whether He knows the weight you carry, the answer is yes. He is the God who sees, the God who provides, the God who gave His own Son so you could be free. And so the invitation stands. Don't admire this story from afar. Step into it. Trust the God who keeps His promises. Surrender your own Isaacs, knowing that what He asks for is never to harm you, but to bring you into something greater. If this story has stirred something in you, take a step today. Pray, open the scriptures, talk to someone about what you've heard. And if you want to hear more stories that reveal God's heart, subscribe, share this with a friend, and join us next time as we explore the incredible, unfolding narrative of His love. Because the story of Moriah is not over. It's still being written through you.